everybody, buenas noches. It's great to join our panelists this evening for tonight's conversation around transitioning from assistant or associate to head or lead teacher in an independent school. I'm really excited to welcome our three panelists, each of whom works in a different school. They'll share a little bit about themselves, their journey. I have some questions that I will be posing to them. And we also invite those of you that are joining live, if you have questions you'd like us to ask, please submit them to me in the chat and I will pose near the end. If you are viewing this webinar afterwards, a recording of the webinar, and you have additional questions that were not addressed, please feel free to email me at jobfair@nysais.org. That's jobfair@nysais.org. And as always, we are preparing and supporting candidates as they are ready for the Saturday, March 4th job fair at Columbia Grammar and Preparatory School. So with that, I would love to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about where you work, the role, what kind of school is your place of employment, knowing that there are many different kinds of schools. How long have you been there? And then tell us a little bit about how long you served in an assistant or associate role. If you change schools, then certainly tell us that information as well, so that we have a sense of who you are, where you are, and where you've been in the roles that some of those that are watching this video will be sitting in a similar predicament. So I would love to ask Heather to go first, Changchup second, and Dylan third.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Mohammed. I am in my first year as a head teacher. I work at Packer Collegiate, which is a nursery through 12th grade co-ed school in Brooklyn. This is my fourth year working at Packer. I have a unique experience of prior to working at Packer, I worked at Trevor Day School. It was a nursery to 12th grade school, but in two buildings. And I worked there for 2 years in second grade as an associate teacher, and then sort of still wanted experience and exposure to other schools and other school culture. So I've been at Packer the last 4 years. I worked as an associate teacher at Packer in fourth grade, in third grade for 2 years, and now I've transitioned back down to second grade, and I'm also in my new role. So new grade, new position, yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Changchup Sherpa, and I go by the pronouns she, her, hers. I'm a fifth grade head teacher right now at Ethical Culture Fieldston School, which is an all-gender school with campus in Manhattan, and then we have a campus in Riverdale as well. The Manhattan campus is pre-K to fifth. This is my second year as a fifth grade head teacher at EC. Prior to that, I came into EC in the capacity of an associate teacher, also in fifth grade. I was there for a year as an associate teacher. And before that, I, again, was an associate teacher in fifth grade. So fifth grade has been kind of like my home base. I was there as I was in my previous school as a fifth grade associate teacher for 2 years. This was an American international school by the name of Lincoln School in Kathmandu, Nepal, which is my home country and where I started my education career.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dylan Bryant. I currently work at the Churchill School and Center, which is a K-12 day school for students specifically with language-based learning disabilities. So if you're not super familiar with that, like the most common one that we kind of throw out there is dyslexia, right? It's not the only thing we serve, but it's just one of the more well-known ones. So that's a great example of our student population. So everybody has some form of learning difference, language-based learning difference. This is my 6th year at Churchill. I've been there my entire teaching career. I started my first year as an assistant teacher. I teach 11th grade chemistry. My second year, My head teacher went on maternity leave and asked me to take over temporarily. It ended up being a permanent gig, and I've been there since. So this is my 5th year as a head teacher at Churchill.
Thank you all so much. I really want to thank you all because the wealth of knowledge that you all are bringing to this conversation is pretty spectacular, from a local perspective in New York as well as an international perspective. And I think it's important for candidates to know that really it's critical to really think about how you make a transition from a position like an assistant or associate teacher to a head or lead teacher. So if you could share a little bit with us about what made you consider independent schools. Tell us about your experiences as an assistant or associate teacher. What were some really memorable positive moments? What were challenges about being an assistant or associate teacher? And as I said, really start with what made you consider independent schools. If you're an alum or if you attended, just sort of tell us about your journey and then about your experiences in that role. Changchup, can you begin, and then Dylan, and then Heather.
Yeah, so that's a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to try my best, but please let me know if I'm talking too much and we need to move on. What made me consider independent schools? I think as a teacher, of course, the class size, student to teacher ratio, right? Independent schools come with smaller class sizes, and that makes a whole lot of difference as a teacher when you have 20 kids that you're responsible for versus 30. So that's very appealing to me, of course. And the curriculum, the flexibility you have, the liberty you have, the trust that the administration has, right, for you as an educator to develop curriculum, to make decisions about your curriculum, the pacing of it, when do you teach it, how do you teach it, how long do you teach it, how much of it do you want to teach it? So really making those decisions based off the students that you have in your classroom, I think is, again, at the core of responsive education. And that is, again, very appealing to me as a teacher. Experiential learning, of course, as opposed to theoretical knowledge. So that is really what brings me to independent schools. And given my experience as a student who has experienced different types of teaching and different education systems altogether. I mean, I came from a school that was very much rooted in, the banking model, teacher at the center, teacher's authority, academics is the prime priority. And then I made the shift to an IB school, an international baccalaureate school, for my the last 3 years of my high school experience. And that was such a critical and formative experience for me as a learner. Just having everything be inquiry based, finding myself in a classroom that was very much, that believed in progressive education, collaboration amongst teacher, amongst students, sharing that agency to create this classroom community, to co-create curriculum. I think that really changed my experience of schooling and education, and really, I think, informed what I wanted from as an educator or as a school, from a school community. So that's what brings me to independent school. My experience as an associate has, I think has been really positive. I was very fortunate to work with head teachers both times, in whom I found amazing friends and also mentors who really supported my ambitions of being a head teacher, who were really receptive of all that I had to bring to the classroom, all the ideas I had for lessons or field trips or resources that I wanted to use in the classroom, whether it was for a social studies lesson or a morning meeting, and the different perspectives I brought in with me as a person of color in independent school spaces. So it's been really positive. That's what I can say. And I'm sure I can add more to that, but I'm going to let Heather and Dylan chime in as well.
Thank you. I think I'll mirror a lot of what was said. I went to Hunter College in the city in Manhattan, and I think I grew up in Westchester. I currently live in Westchester, so my personal trajectory was always like Westchester schools. I know that there's a lot of really great school districts, so I just kind of assumed I would end up there. While I was in Hunter, and I was pursuing my teaching degree, a friend of mine who worked at the Churchill School and Center said, hey, why don't you consider this assistant teacher position? And the reason that appealed to me and I got really excited about it was because it was such a learning opportunity. So I think a lot of first year teachers, when you hear the stories, sometimes unfortunately it's horror stories, right, of people who jump right into the DOE. They're like, I had nothing, I had no resources, no time, I cried every night, it was miserable, blah, 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 right? And that is scary. And I think it's why we lose a lot of teachers. So the assistant teacher role was so perfect because you are still a teacher, you're in the classroom, but you kind of have like a built-in mentor in the form of a head teacher. And I was so privileged to have a head teacher who I really collabed with, who really wanted to mentor me and help me to grow. So that's what kind of appealed to me, was that opportunity to learn and to grow and to kind of have almost like a transitional period, not just jumping right into the deep end and doing that. And then I think that directly relates again to my experiences as an assistant teacher. I was really privileged to have a really positive head teacher, as I said before. I think the thing about independent schools and the assistant teacher role, or I'll mention this and then I'll say this, something else about independent schools. In my training program as a science teacher, as an upper school science teacher, a lot of what we learn in New York schools, right? I went to a New York college. To be in a New York schools was regents, right? How to prep for regents, how to do labs with minimum resources. Like that was a big focus. How do you do labs when you have no money and 30 kids? And how do you make sure they pass the regents? And I was like, that sounds awful. I know it's a reality, but it just sounds so uninteresting to me. So as Cheng-Shu mentioned, not having the regents, right? Having the ability to have freedom in my curriculum, having the ability to really do inquiry things, do labs that I couldn't do if I had kind of that regimented time schedule. And having two teachers in the room, my school specifically, it's mandated. We're actually 12-1-1. So we're 12 students in a classroom with two teachers, right? So really small classes, you really get to know the students, you can do a lot of things. So that was an appealing part of independent schools. And then as an assistant teacher, again, having that ability to be creative, having to do all that was a really positive experience that helped me to prepare for my role as a head teacher.
Thanks. I echo so much of what has already been said. For me, I think that I approached working in independent schools sort of after college. I got my undergraduate degree in education, and I felt like I had more questions about becoming a teacher, even after having done my student teaching experience, was left with sort of like more wonder. And so for me, doing the associate teacher role was just this great opportunity to collaborate with someone, learn sort of side by side. And then within the independent school, I think I teetered back and forth for a long time about kind of working in public schools, but I just sort of felt right at home and this is working. And so for me, I think the big pull to working in independent school is the community at large, the community and partnerships and commitment to partnerships with families that exist. And then kind of what's already been said for me, it's the support. I work in a 2-teacher model. Both independent schools that I've worked in have had that. And so for me, in the capacity now of mentoring and supporting someone who's in a learning role, but I think with the framework of that being at the forefront of, I work in a lower school, but the lower school model, there's so much opportunity to kind of continue to build your practice and support someone. So that's kind of been a big driving force to keeping me in staying in independent schools. And you mentioned some challenges. And I think just to speak on that, I think that as an associate teacher, so much is contingent on what capacity you have where you are and the person you're working with meeting you where you are. So I think if you embrace the role as what can I learn and what can I take from this opportunity, there's so much space to grow. So I think that it's a challenge in itself to be committed to that, be committed to the work. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, thank you all. Absolutely answers the question from lots of different angles. And the transition has been a successful one, clearly, for the three of you. as we think about, for those of us that are visual, when you describe a typical day, how is being a head teacher or lead teacher different from being an assistant or associate teacher? And you know, if you could each cite like one example that you can describe, so that we give 3 different perspectives. So if somebody takes, you know, what you were going to say, I'm sure there's something else that you can highlight that would be really helpful for us, so that we can hear, you know, a few ways that a typical day really has changed for you in a lead or head teacher role. So Changchup, can you begin, and then Heather and Dylan.
One example that just comes to mind immediately is, of course, the workload is significantly heavier in that you are the point person in the room for the kids, but also if you're working with other associate teachers, you're also the person who's responsible for all of them. And that's a lot of work to put in, other than the teaching that you're doing, right? The lesson planning, the organizing of materials, preparing them, getting the space ready, any assessment you might do, grading student work. So all of that is part of the teaching package. But outside of that, communication with families is a big one that comes to mind, right? Especially when it's time for reports, conferences. So all of that, communication on a daily basis even. So that is something that is significantly different from when I was an associate teacher. I was primarily focused on the kids, the teaching that was happening, the day-to-day learning that was happening in the classroom. There were, of course, specific lessons or subjects that I might have a particular interest in that I was more involved in, right, in terms of planning, in terms of researching resources, activities, and teaching. But definitely the load is significantly different and more when you are the head teacher.
So I think this is something I reflect on constantly, but I'm in my first year and I'm also transitioning in the same school. So I think for me, I'm often reflecting on sort of like what's on my plate. So a really good example is last year, I felt so eager to transition into this new role and become a head teacher. And in every sort of facet of the job, I felt super prepared. I think the biggest difference between last year feeling so ready, like I can do it, and transitioning, and is that all of the plates are up in the air and they have to stay there and they don't drop. And then that, like, I'm the person carrying it. So if you have a strong teaching partner, then you have this extra effort collaborating, but that sole responsibility is on you. And it's so I think that that's kind of a big player. I think for me, other things that have been the biggest changes is that I think much bigger picture about the class, the culture, the ethos of the environment, and sort of maybe as in like the associate role, there were individual kids I might have really supported my head teacher, like supporting them individually, and felt great about it. And sort of in my capacity as a head teacher, I'm leading the whole class. And so for me, that means that I might need to rely on my teaching partner more to collaborate one-on-one with certain kids who might need X, Y, and Z. And or I have to also think about that in addition to the big picture of meeting kind of kids where they are. And I think that just, you know, the decision making of every day and knowing that you are navigating the ship of the classroom and that you sort of keep the tone, and like the days are long and the weeks go by quickly. This idea that like you're sort of like you're the director of the ship, and so kind of keeping the tone that you want for a positive flow, and so that kids feel joy in their day, that relies on you. And so I think I think that's something I've reflected a lot about this year. Yeah.
I think the biggest thing for me was classroom management looked a lot different. So there was a positive and like the interesting part. So the positive was like, as an assistant teacher, I'd walk in the room and I'd try to command attention, and it was funny, certain kids would be like, right, like, you know. But then like I became a head teacher, that's my official title, and I walk in the room and I'm like, it's a different presence. It's like, oh, okay, like my voice carries more weight. I don't think it should be that way, but it's like the reality, right? Students know that you're the head teacher, so it carries a bit more weight. So that was cool. The challenge or the interesting part was if I ever had a challenging student situation, or maybe I didn't handle things the best way that I didn't love as an assistant teacher, you step back, you speak with your head teacher, you reflect. Your head teacher either gives you direction on how to move forward, or the head teacher will say, I'll take over and I'll handle it. Thank you so much. As the head teacher, right? Like if something doesn't go well, sometimes like I ended up in the office as my supervisor, like, hey, I need to follow up on the situation. I was like, oh, like this got so much more real, right? Because it's not necessarily like I have someone to fall back on, right? We have collaboration with our teammates, but as the head teacher, like the buck sort of stops with you, right? You are the final decision maker. So when it comes to handling student issues, right, if something goes wrong, that's on you. And sometimes even with the assistant teacher that you work with, like as their mentor, if something goes wrong with them, it's kind of on you, right? Like you're the one who's controlling the tone of the classroom. So there's a lot more managing going on. I think the classroom management piece just looks different.
So much good information. Thank you for giving us three very distinct, actually more than three, distinct ways that it has felt different. It has been seen different. You have experienced it differently. I think that's really helpful for the candidates that are really thinking about this transition. I'm curious, what other responsibilities besides your role as leader head teacher have you taken on? You know, whether, and if you haven't taken anything on just yet, speak a little bit about why that's been the right decision for you. Because the expectation is that you can and you will, and maybe you can and you will at some point. So what other responsibilities besides teaching have you taken on? And is there anything that you recommend, both in terms of role and responsibilities and also timing, you know, which year, at which point, those kinds of things. So would love to hear from Heather and then Dylan and Chengchu.
Do you mean responsibilities within the school or just? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So my teaching team this year, they have told me that in every way possible, I need to stay and become a minimalist, which means that my personality is so invested in collaborating and yes, and what else? And they've been, no, just do focus on you. And I think that's been kind of the opposite of when I was an associate teacher, sort of like how are all of the ways that I can help and jump in, understand, learn, and know. And they've just sort of been this reoccurring echo all the time of you need to just focus on you. This year, you don't have to be a helper. And I think that that's been something that's been a hard pill to swallow, but it's allowed me to just kind of focus on my instruction, on my classroom, and all of the responsibilities I have. And so I think different parts of the year, I felt really happy that that's been the case. And then there is this other sort of like, oh, I'm interested in taking on and being more. Yeah, the last part of your question, I missed what the last part was.
You answered it. It was, and if you haven't, you know, what would you recommend or what would you want to do, and the timing. And I think you spoke beautifully to the advice that your colleagues are given as a way to extend grace to you in this first year of transition. And it makes a lot of sense.
I think something else that they've said to me that is taken me a while to understand this idea of minimalist as a maximalist, but it has also been like part of if you feel like you've understand what you're teaching the next day, or that you have pace something out, or that you've had time to like, look at student work and make a plan and or communicate to families, that you're building in time to reflect on your process too. And so I think that that's kind of been a piece that I've really built in, because as someone who's, planning and leading everything, that I have less time to do that. And so I try to continue to build in time to think about that in my practice.
So as I mentioned before, this is my 6th year at my school, my 5th year as a head teacher. So I've always kind of had my feet dipped in several different things. I was always like, I want to just be involved. I want to do things, and not even for recognition or title, just because it was like, I care. I was like, let me do this. So it started off with really pushing, being a part of the push for diversity, equity, inclusion, right? I think a lot of independent schools have someone in that position or in that role now. We just got our person, our director, about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's made a world of difference. But even since my first year, just advocating for students of color, for professionals of color, right, for people of any marginalized identity was huge. So this is my 2nd year and with an official title. So I'm the equity and inclusion coordinator for the high school division of our K through 12 school. And basically my role in that position is, as I mentioned before, we have a director who's overseeing, right, programmatic things, K through 12 things, administrative things, senior leadership things. So my job is just kind of be the day-to-day person, right? The little things that happen, the student issues, be a point person for teachers, could check this lesson with me, a student did this, something's happening here, so to do that. And that's been really exciting, and it's something I've always been passionate about. So it's cool to now like have an official capacity to do that. And then the other role I've had the opportunity to take on, which I feel like relates to my role as an equity coordinator, is this is my 2nd year leading something we call the Assistant Teacher Support Program. So basically, we have a mentorship program, but all new people in new positions or new teachers get mentors. The issue with giving assistant teachers mentors is there was way too much overlap, right? Because your inherent mentor was your head teacher. So then you had this separate mentor, and a lot of assistant teachers felt like, when do I go to the mentor? When do I just talk to my head teacher? When do I talk to my department chair? When do I talk to my grade leader, right? Like, I don't know how to use the mentor. So they condensed it into one person, right? That's the assistant teacher mentor. And then I'm that person. And then I also plan monthly PDs for the assistant teachers. And the reason I love doing this is because, and where this grew from, is my first year as an assistant teacher, my school planned a professional development on classroom management, and the advice was wonderful, but not helpful. So a great example was like, they said, okay, what do you do if a student's being rowdy? And the advice I was given was like, make sure your lesson is engaging and there's no room for them to be rowdy. And I was like, that's true. And that's amazing. I don't plan the lessons. I'm an assistant teacher, right? So when my head teacher walks out the room and I'm not planning, like, I have no control over that, right? So I have the opportunity to be in a position where I try to plan assistant teacher specific professional development. Like, as you're in this role, here's professional development designed for you. So we did a classroom management PD as an assistant teacher, right? Because that looks different than being a head teacher. So those are 2 things I've gotten to take on that I find really fulfilling and really exciting.
I think I'll speak to that from my experience as an associate teacher and then as a head teacher now. As an associate teacher, like I mentioned before, there's less on my plate, while all very fulfilling and enriching in their own way. So that's when I found I had a lot of time and energy to dedicate myself to other things that were happening within the school community. And it was also a great opportunity for me to get outside of my classroom space and collaborate and meet with other community members, whether they're faculty, whether they're admin, or kids that are not in your class, who are not in your classroom, who are not in the grade that you teach. So in my previous school, as an assistant teacher, I led an after-school program called Leader in Me, and my principal was my direct supervisor in terms of all the after-school programs we run. And so it was a great opportunity for me to build a relationship with him and get to meet him outside of classroom space. Outside of the classroom space, in the principal teacher, associate teacher capacity, just as, okay, 2 people who are running these after-school programs. As an associate teacher in EC, I also volunteered to co-facilitate the AAPI racial affinity group. Again, I thought it was a great way to build community. And I joined EC the year COVID happened. I think that was 2020 to 2021 academic year. So it was a very insular experience. I was in our pod, the head teacher and my other associate teacher in the classroom were the only two faculty members that I was interacting with on a daily basis. I didn't see anybody else at all. So I thought that was a great opportunity for me to then mingle with the other kids, the other fourth graders, the other fifth graders, and my co-facilitator who was a third grade associate teacher at the time. So that presented a wonderful opportunity. My first year as a head teacher at EC, which was last year, so I'm a relatively new teacher, a new head teacher, I realized I needed to take the time. So I very much agree with Heather here to prioritize and focus on what I need to do, what my job is first and foremost, which is I'm here responsible for these 22 kids in my fifth grade classroom, planning, teaching, instruction, classroom community, and classroom management. So that's what I chose to focus my energy on instead of overwhelming myself with too much that first year. And I would recommend that if you're, finding yourself in a first of any kind, whether you're transitioning to a new school and that's your first year in that school, or it's your first year as a head teacher anywhere. I think it was really helpful for me to take the time to just focus on a few things, focus on the classroom and get to just learn more about the community. And then when I'm ready, just, put myself out there when I'm ready to take on more or when I'm familiar with more. So this year being my second year, a friend and a colleague presented this opportunity to be a part of the faculty council board. So I am, that's something that I'm involved in outside of my classroom. I am an faculty council associate board member. The commitments aren't as much. So, it's just 2 meetings a month. So it works out for me. But at the same time, I'm putting myself out there. And for the first time since COVID, getting to, step outside my classroom and interact with some of these colleagues who have been in the building for 2 years, but never saw until last September. So it's been really great. And also it provides an opportunity for me to get to know my admin better. And also is an opportunity for me to kind of develop my leadership skills as well. So again, I'm taking it easy, one step at a time. And eventually, hopefully, if I feel comfortable, with my role as a teacher in my classroom and feel ready to take on more, I think there are opportunities always lurking around. And I think everybody should just check in with themselves, see how you're feeling, if you're ready for it, or if you're overwhelmed, and see where that takes you.
So much good advice being offered. There have been a couple of questions that have come in, and I want to try and synthesize them and then target the responses to some of you, because I think you can speak to the questions. So there's one question about how can you really indicate readiness to be in a lead or head teacher position? And in particular, if you could speak to, so for instance, Heather, you were in an assistant or associate position at one school, you stepped into a parallel role, and then you stepped into the head role. So can you speak a little bit to what you did to be able to communicate from within your school to be able to make that vertical move, and also, from within needing to make the shift? Like, why did you make the shift?
So one is, how did I know that I was ready to make the shift? And then how did I do it? Okay. Okay. So how did I know? I was an associate for so many years, 5. In 2 schools, I taught with people in a pandemic, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And so with that, there's the range of sort of like what is needed to be a teacher now. I also, in that same time, did my degree at Bank Street. And I had a lot of time to think about what are all of the different aspects that make up the job. And I think that my sense of awareness of like what falls on the plate and what is a priority, and just my comfort with families and communication, my comfort with leading instruction, my comfort with just taking on curriculum, planning and leading. And I think that that just sort of grew the more time and experience that I had. I also feel very fortunate that I had some really positive partnerships and some that were more tricky. And I think that the pandemic plays a big role in sort of like what is needed and required. And so I think that I had a unique experience of, because I taught with and collaborated with people in a pandemic, it felt like it was a very equal, like we need to split it in half because people needed to be able to survive that. And so I think with that, there was just sort of a transparent door of like, this is the responsibility that's falling on me. What else can you take on your plate? And I think that I'm just a very eager person to learn and to grow and to take on. So I think that sort of supported just my own investment and curiosity. So I think just in terms of being ready, I think also had a lot of conversations with my teaching partners about like, what are they doing, just to understand the role and the capacity of what they're taking on. And I just sort of came to a place where I realized that, you know, when you're absent, I like have great days, you know, and I like doing the job, and I just wanted more responsibility. Like I was eager for more responsibility. And then in terms of like making that jump, I actually had no intention of staying at Packer. There was a lot of messaging to me that the opportunity wouldn't be available. There wasn't any openings, and or that they recommended that the ATs kind of seek employment elsewhere. So I did I applied out. I went on job interviews, and I partnered. I was like looking through the like job websites, and I think that just sort of was a very intense time, but a time of like really sort of thinking about like you know, like in terms of what is my skill set? Can I talk about my teaching? Can I talk about my experience? Can I feel confidence in that? Should I keep going about readiness? Because I think that's sort of like a big question. How I did a lot of mock interviews with people. I talked to people on my teaching team about my practice, just sort of informally. And I felt like I was doing that a lot. And then when it came time to actually interviewing, there's, you know, demo lesson involved, there's interviewing, there's sort of forming a connection with a school. And so it's a lot of work on your end, but I think I really try to prioritize that I'm seeking an opportunity to know what else is out there, what other communities are out there. Does it feel like a right fit for me? I think so it was a two-way street. And then, you know, then opportunity came, and communicating my messaging to my school about wanting to stay there, but also having to advocate for, you know, this is me in this role. And I think it was a very positive experience, but a lot of work involved. And now I'm rambling, but yeah.
No, I appreciate that, because we certainly don't want anybody to walk away from this webinar or just the conversation about transitioning from one role to another and just to assume that it only happens within schools. It's a both and situation. It's not an either or. Sometimes it's circumstance that creates an unexpected vacancy. Dylan spoke to that in his introduction, and then he stepped in, and you know, you step in and you begin to own it, and then you just keep going and you just make it happen, and you stay in that role. And sometimes it's you actively seek either a peer level AT position at another school. Maybe you might go from an all gender school to you know, a girls or a boys school, or maybe you go from a school with students with learning differences to a school that doesn't necessarily highlight learning differences in its mission and pedagogy specifically. So there's lots of ways to sort of look and think about how you transition within different schools, both across and also vertically. And there's always something to learn. What advice would you give people who really want to present themselves and be seen as more than just the assistant or the associate teacher as they are pursuing head teacher roles? Like, what would you look for if you were the person in the hiring manager role for the head teacher position or part of the committee? What would be advice that you would offer? Changchup, do you have anything that comes to mind? And then Dylan, I'll ask you.
Yes, two things come to mind. A, expressing your interest. I think it's always a good idea to put it out there, like, hey, just so you know, I'm coming into the space as an associate teacher, yes, but I'm really interested. I want to be a head teacher. I mean, I remember my interview with my principal for the role of an associate teacher in 5th grade at EC, and the part where I asked questions of my own at the end of the interview, one of the questions I asked was, all right, what would the career trajectory for someone like me look like in EC, for someone like me who's coming into an associate teacher role but wants to eventually be a head teacher? Is that a possibility in your school? Is there room for growth there? How long would it take if that is the case? So right from the get-go, my principal knew I was interested. And I expressed that to my head teacher as well. I would ask a lot of questions about planning and reflecting on lessons that I would teach, right? And always offer ideas of my own, whether it was used or not, right? And just like, oh, I have this resource. Okay, coming in with ideas. Again, like I said, it could be a core curriculum lesson, or it could be a morning meeting, whatever it is. I think that eagerness, being ready with your tools and skills, and when the opportunity arises, like, oh, here's what I have in mind. What do you think? And so that's one, just expressing and vocalizing your interest. And then the second thing I'm thinking of is, of course, more time in front of the classroom, as they say, right? Letting them know that you're interested in teaching, you can lead. Your head teacher is absent for whatever reasons, like tell them they don't need to, get a sub, seek a sub, tell them your response now you are ready for, you feel ready for, and you would like to be the sub for the day instead. I mean, I know that's what happened. We had, when I was an associate teacher in EC, again, this was COVID year, so we had 2 associate teachers and 1 head teacher, and my head teacher was out for, I don't remember what reason, but she was out, and we had a sub that first day. And then we, in our end of the day notes, we let her know that, oh, we know the kids, I think we got it between the 2 of us. I don't think we need a sub for tomorrow. How do you feel about it? And of course, we had a really good relationship with her. She knew us, she knew what we were capable of. She knew that we had a relationship with the kids. So she was like, yes, on board, let's have you 2 lead the classes. And I think more time like that in front of the classroom, teaching, planning, leading, really, I think helped me feel better prepared and ready, built my confidence and my teaching skills, and also showed my head teacher that I was ready for the role.
So yeah, I've thankfully had the opportunity to kind of be on both ends, in the sense of like I applied and went through the hiring process, but I've also sat on hiring committees for assistant teachers who were applying to be head teachers. I think the biggest piece of advice, and this is something that I deeply internalize, is like your time as an assistant or associate teacher is like a year-long job application for your role as a head teacher. So part of it, as was mentioned before, is like, when your head teacher is absent, do you jump up? But like your reputations are, you can develop a reputation, right? When people hear that your head teacher is absent, they're like, oh, like Changchup mentioned, do we need to put someone in that room, or will that person be okay? What kind of culture do you create in the school, right? Do people rely on you? Do people say, oh, like, I'm so glad I have so-and-so working with me, or I'm so glad to hear this, right? Do you kind of volunteer for things? Do you have maybe a club? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? Are you known to be reliable? And then, as someone who's been a part of a hiring committee, then when an assistant teacher is applying for that position, and a lot of times, not necessarily, but a lot of times, right, the assistant teacher is someone who's less experienced. So that's their disadvantage, is they may not have as much teaching experience. But the thing that comes up as well, we know that this person, right, is a go-getter. We know that this person will make arrangements to, right, seek out the help they need. I think a really big thing is like, how do you take feedback? Do you seek out feedback? I think I'm a person who loves feedback. And I think after a lesson, I would sit down with my head teacher and say, okay, like, how did that go? How do you feel about this? What can we do better? Where do we go from here? And that was just something we constantly did. And it was a learning process for me, but it also showed a willingness to learn and grow. And those are the type of people that you really want in your head teacher positions, not someone who's going to be like, this is my room, I make the rules, blah, blah, but someone who's going to be a part of the community. So I think that's a really big one, is like, how do you accept feedback and look for feedback? And then not just looking for feedback to look for feedback, looking for feedback to truly grow, taking it in and using it, and then following up on that feedback and continuing to grow and just really learning from that position. So I think that's a really important thing, is just being a team player, willing to grow, and thinking about the culture and community that you help to create in the school.
Great words of wisdom, really concrete, constructive. You asked for feedback. I'm going to offer it. Excellent. Really well done. We've started to talk a little bit about the hiring process, and some of you alluded to the following, so I'm just going to state it. When you are an assistant or associate teacher, you're already interviewing for a head teacher job. Whether you realize it or not, it is happening. That is the same, the same holds true for an opportunity that becomes available in a school, and you're already working in the school and you decide to apply. The second that you submit an application and someone else but you knows that you're interested, the interview process has officially continued, because it had started the second you walked in. So that's an important thing to really keep in mind. The second thing I want to note before we transition to a little more specific about hiring is that the assistant or associate roles within independent schools are designed not to last in perpetuity. They are meant to support teachers in the collaborative ways that you've all mentioned, both working with a head teacher, with an assistant teacher mentor, as you mentioned, Dylan, and also, across a grade, and other assistant or associate teachers. So there's something sort of embedded and built in that's part of the expectation that at some point you will either leave to continue to grow at a different school in an assistant or associate capacity to continue to learn and grow, and you might be applying to a head teacher position elsewhere. And the reality is that you think you're ready and you don't ever really know that you're ready until you are on and moving forward. So I just wanted to contextualize that for our audience, because I really think it's important. It is not easy to go from being from within to being promoted to head teacher. It has its roses and its thorns, and it's all buds of opportunity across the board, internally and externally. So just putting it that way. What do you think, besides what's already been said, is there anything in particular that candidates can expect or should expect from the hiring process? So about 2 years ago, during COVID, everything was done virtual. Some candidates will do an initial virtual, some will do all in person, some will do on phone. So that we know, and there's a panel coming up in the next few weeks, specifically to talk about hiring and what to expect at every level. So rather than go down that road, what was something that happened during your hiring process that was either unexpected, that you didn't prepare for, that you think is a really good piece of advice for people to be thinking about? Is the question clear? Like, what happened? What didn't you expect? What's a good piece of advice that you would want people to be ready for in the hiring process? Heather, Changchup, and then Dylan.
Okay, I think that I was aware that they would, at any potential job, would ask me, you're making this jump, and so how do you know that you're ready? And I think I had to speak to that. I think that my best advice is that if you are applying and there are other people of more experience than you, why is hiring you the right choice? So knowing that you're coming from an associate role and that you might need support stepping into your new role, why are you kind of the stronger candidate? What do you have to offer? I think just sort of really being prepared to speak to that, because you're applying to the job, and so you really want to showcase who you are. I think that's huge for me, and I think just the number of ways that had been asked to me was sort of like, I don't want to just have a short answer. I want it to be really thoughtful, but you're judging me based on my answer. So I really want to let you know why it would be a mistake not to choose me. And then I think that the other piece of advice is that I think holistically, when applying, as an AT, I think that the collaborative piece is really huge. And so I think that there's a lot of questions around how you collaborate with other people in your community. And so just knowing that being able to speak beyond just like your instruction and sort of like your readiness for the job, but like you sort of the questions around understanding your role beyond just your classroom, like being a teacher in a school, sort of like what do you have to offer? So I think bigger questions came up. Yeah.
I'm just reflecting on my hiring process and thinking about what was unexpected. I think, as we know, as part of the hiring process, of course, you have to go into the classroom and you teach a plan and teach a demo lesson. And so there's so many variables there because you're working with kids in the classroom, humans, and nothing is going to go exactly the 100% the way you planned. So yes, there's always an element of surprise. You're not getting the answer or response that you, while you were planning, expected you would, or if it's a completely different perspective that a student brings in, or the pacing is lower, so you're not, your lesson is taking twice the time and you're not done with it in the given time. So I think that is something that is always unexpected, and was in my case as well. I wasn't able to finish the lesson in the given time because there was a lot of collaboration that was supposed to happen, and it did, and it was so fruitful that it ended up taking longer. And I was, of course, panicking about it. I'm like, oh my God, I was supposed to finish this and it's taking longer. But I think the important piece then is to what Dylan was saying earlier, which is very important, the reflection piece, right? What went well and what could have been better. Yes, I didn't finish on time. I couldn't wrap it up. But at the same time, right, perhaps that was deliberate because this collaboration piece was amazing, and giving the students more time to then interact with each other, engage with each other is meaningful, and they have more to take away from that rather than interrupting that halfway through. And, or even naming what didn't go well and then thinking about what would you do differently. I think that says a lot about you as an educator, as a person who is reflective and responsive. So I think that is something I'm thinking of right now. It was also a different experience altogether. As somebody who was, in the school as an associate teacher and then interviewed within the team, because I was a 5th grade associate teacher and I applied for a 5th grade head teacher. So members of the hiring committee, some of them were part of the 5th grade team who I worked with. So it was weird coming into the space and then talking about myself as if they didn't know me already and trying to think of something new that I could tell about myself that, again, they didn't know already. But I think one shouldn't shy away from the fact, that fact, and just still put it out there, because you never want to assume that they would know. They know me, they've worked with me for a year, they would know. I was in front of my head teacher talking about my experience in her classroom with her, co-teaching with her, talking about her as if she was a third person. And it was all a little weird, but I think it's still important. You name what you did, despite all the awkwardness and weirdness, I think it's still important to put it out there. You can never assume that, you know, one would know everything you have to say or everything about there is to know about you as a teacher.
The thing that was most surprising for me was the process took longer than I thought. And I think, again, perspective is so important. So my first, again, as an assistant teacher, I was a go-getter, right? I'm a certified chemistry teacher. So they were like excited to have that. They're like, we don't get these often. And my head teacher was like, I want you to take over, right? So in my mind, I was like, great, like, give me the job. But I went through the process, had an interview, all that was said and done. And then it took a while for them to get back to me. And I was like, what's going on? They're like, we're still reviewing everything, right? And we still have candidates. And years later, my principal told me, like, whether he should have told me or not, I don't know, but we were speaking freely, so it's okay. He was like, you know, honestly, he's like, we feel like we took a risk on you, but we're glad because it paid off. And I was like, what does that mean? But in their mind, it's like, oh, you're a first year assistant teacher and experience, right? And we put you in the head teacher position, like that's a lot to take on. So I think fast forward to today where I've had the opportunity to be in that position of interviewing current assistant teachers, right? It's like sometimes you see people who are really likable, maybe everybody likes them, right? Or they have strengths that they feel should make them a shoo-in, or maybe they're like, it's a 10th grade position and the 10th grade team's like, we want you so bad, right? But then they sit down with the hiring committee and something doesn't go well, or right, then questions come up or concerns come up. So the process does take a while, and I think it's always best and just like to have humility and never ever assume that like you're an automatic shoo-in. We've unfortunately had people where like I remember an assistant teacher who had started the year before I did. He was an assistant teacher, I think, for 4 or 5 years. Everybody loved him, super sweet guy. The kids all loved him, but he sat down for his interview, and an interview that was supposed to take 45 minutes took 15 minutes because he was just so short. Kind of what Chang Chup said, right? Kind of just assuming like, you know me, and it went well. And unfortunately, they couldn't move him forward in that process. They were like, based on this interview alone, and for being really equitable, you did not interview well. So I think, again, treating it like a real interview, remembering that if hopefully your school is viewing you, right, you have your experience there and people know you, but if they're viewing you in an unbiased way, right, you have to treat it like an actual interview and make sure that you're putting your best foot forward. And then even when you are in the position, make sure that you give it 110%, because there may be people on your hiring committee, right, who said no or something. So just keeping all of that in mind and taking it in stride and being patient with the process.
Fantastic suggestions. One last one that I want to offer is, if you have the opportunity to serve on a hiring committee as an assistant or associate teacher, I would encourage you to participate. It is exceptional professional development for you to learn and understand. It will give you insight into the thinking process, into just all the components that come together of committee work, which I think is different than grade level work or cross grade level or cross disciplinary work. So that's one piece of advice. And the other from a hiring perspective is, do not be surprised if you are asked to speak to your pedagogy and practice as an educator. What have you thought about? What have you learned? What are you bringing? What are you interested in pursuing? So on and so forth. So there's a series of questions that you should certainly expect, and our panelists have done a phenomenal job this evening of providing lots of really good tidbits. And we know that looking for a job and making that transition takes time and takes patience. So I want to thank you all for offering your wisdom and speaking from your experience. I want to thank everyone who's been able to join us live. Wonderful questions that you were posing as well. And if you're watching this, as I said at the beginning, if you are watching this recording and you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, jobfair@nysais.org, jobfair@nysais.org. I promise I am the person who's going to respond. And if I don't have the answer, I know lots of people, including my 3 colleagues on the screen and many, many others, who would be willing to answer the question and provide some advice as you prepare. Please, if you haven't already, please pre-register for the NYSAIS Job Fair, Saturday, March 4th. Thank you all once again for joining us. Thank you to my colleague Matt from NYSAIS and all of my colleagues at NYSAIS for the continued support. We look forward to seeing you. There will be 85 schools at the job fair and quite a few opportunities to pursue for both assistant and associate positions, as well as lead, head, or co-teaching positions, which would be 2 head teachers or lead teachers co-teaching in that role. Some schools have that model as well. So thanks, everyone. Have a great evening, and we will see you on March 4th.